everybody. My pleasure to welcome you to a new Tocqueville lecture series organized by the Tocqueville program and the Ostrom workshop and the political science department. My name is Aurelian Craiuțu and I am the director of this small program that has the honor of hosting today Professor George Thomas. George is an old friend of mine. He's a professor of political science. He has an endowed chair, Wolford Professor of American Political Institutions and director of the Salvatore Center at Claremont McKenna College in Claremont, California. George is an expert on constitutional law and American political thought, I should say. He's the author of several books, the author of The Unwritten Constitution, Oxford University Press forthcoming, and as well as the founders and the idea of a national university, Cambridge University Press, and the Madisonian Constitution published by Johns Hopkins University Press. George has been publishing articles and pieces in other non-academic outlets such as the Washington Post and the Atlantic. And we've invited Professor Thomas today to talk about James Madison and the American Republican experiment. This is part of a series that the Tocqueville program this year devotes to rethinking the idea of America. We had in the fall, Professor Brad Wilson from the Madison program at Princeton talking about Alexander Hamilton. And then we had the talk about the meaning and the symbolism of the Statue of Liberty by Francesca Viano from Italy. Today's lecture will be followed next week by a lecture on the idea of fraternity and democracy in America, which will give us an opportunity to meet another faculty at Claremont, this time at Pomona College, Susan Barnes McWilliams. This will be next Friday at noon. The format will be as follows. Professor Thomas will speak for about 30 minutes, after which Matthew Luckey, who is an ABD PhD candidate in the political science department at IU, will give a 10-minute response. And after that, we'll open up for question and answers. As always, we'll try to accommodate as many questions and comments as possible. I would like to invite you to post them in the chat and raise your hand electronically. And I'll try to combine 2 or 3 at the same time. We will end up promptly at 1:30. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Thomas. And George, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. It's great to be here. And I'll before I even start, I'll plug next week's talk by Susan Barnes McWilliams, or Susan McWilliams Barnes. She's a great friend and actually a faculty affiliate of the Salvatore Center, and we do lots of great things together here, including having Aurelian out. But let me just start by saying it's an honor to participate in the Ostrom workshop and the Tocqueville Forum. The Ostroms were great political scientists in the tradition of Tocqueville who thought carefully about how institutions could help shape and nourish liberal democracy. And so I'm delighted to continue in that tradition and would like to thank Aurelian for the invitation to speak about Madison in that context. And I'll also, in the context of thinking of this as, based on American ideas, and that Hamilton was the subject of a talk last semester, and as brilliant as the musical Hamilton is, and as brilliant as Hamilton is, think of Madison as the greater founder here, clearly superior to Hamilton in thinking about liberal democracy, both as a thinker and as a practitioner, which is not to downplay Hamilton, but it's to play up Madison. So let me begin thinking today about where we sit with American democracy. America's Republican experiment is under pressure. Today, 1 in 6 Americans say that it is not important to live in a democracy and would opt for some form of authoritarianism. Increasing numbers of Americans think that it is acceptable to use violence to achieve political ends. And this was before the awful events of January 6th. Populists insist on the straight will of the people, dispensing with our political institutions and deliberation, and simply going with whatever the people happen to want at a particular moment. Others, technocrats especially, would dispense with popular government altogether and have us yield to various experts. I want to say that both are really challenges to America's Republican experiment. And I want to use Madison today really to think about the nature of what we call democratic or Republican government, and think about it as a challenge to our current understanding of American democracy or Republican government, which is increasingly populist. I think there is a serious kind of technocratic challenge. I think there is a serious temptation to kind of dispense with the difficulties of popular government. And I want to talk a bit about that, but I really want to dwell on Madison as a foil to our more populist understandings, what's often even called these days sort of folk democracy, because I think he's most illuminating there. And I also think Madison is particularly helpful in helping us sort out today this question that you've probably heard in the last couple of years of whether we live in a republic or whether we live in a democracy. And so I want to say a bit about that as well. And these are the questions at the center of my talk. But let me begin by answering, I think, what's a fair question. Why Madison, right? Why do we care what some white guy who lived 200 years ago and enslaved his fellow human beings thinks about democracy? So let me give a couple of reasons. I think first, because he thought more carefully and fully about popular government than almost anyone. And he was a rare combination. He was both a thinker and a practitioner. Madison helped create the world that we inhabit. To be sure, the popular government he brought into being was deeply imperfect, but the ideas he set in motion helped shape how we see the world. Understanding his thinking will better help us understand the world we inhabit, both how it's similar to the world he inhabited and how it's different. Most importantly, I think, Madison offers a vision of popular government that insists on educating and refining the public mind as part of constructing the public good. I think that's the part that we're in danger of losing. That's the part, I think, that folk democracy or a populist understanding of democracy challenges us in ways that is really a threat to the Republican experiment at Roost. But let me be clear of why I'm not turning to Madison at the same time. I do not suggest that we turn to Madison to follow whatever he happened to say. I don't think we turn to the founding generation in general to say, oh, what did the founders think about X? Therefore, let's do X. I don't think the founders thought that way. I don't think it does them credit to think of them in that way. I think we turn to them because they thought carefully about political problems, and they can help us understand the kinds of problems that we inhabit. So at the outset of my talk, I want to quote Madison from Federalist 14. Now, this is probably a quote you don't hear as often from Madison, but it's his second contribution to the Federalist Papers. I'll turn to his first, Federalist 10, in just a moment. But this is Madison. Is it not the glory of the people of America that, whilst they have paid a decent regard to the opinions of former times in other nations, they have not suffered a blind veneration for antiquity, for custom, or for names, to overrule the suggestions of their own good sense, the knowledge of their own situation, and the lessons of their own experience? That's the spirit I want to turn to Madison in. So let me begin with the world that Madison inhabited. Madison offered a defense of popular government when it was novel and in much need of a defense. We take popular government for granted, but when Madison was arguing for popular government, it was not in fact popular. The history of democracy, as grasped by the founders, drawn largely from the ancient world, revealed that overbearing majorities could all too easily lend themselves to mob rule, dominating minorities and trampling individual rights. Democracy was also susceptible to demagogues, men of factious tempers and sinister designs, as Madison said in Federalist 10, who relied on the vicious arts to betray the interests of the people. Madison, nevertheless, sought to defend popular government, the rule of the many, rather than retreat to the rule of the few. In fact, the Federalist Papers, and I understand a lot of the students are reading those right now, framed itself as a debate over the very possibility of establishing popular government, which is why it was so often referred to as an experiment. And I want us to hold on to that, right? Because the very notion of an experiment suggests something that is ongoing. And I think that's in fact the right way to look at it, right? The democratic experiment or the Republican experiment is the work of generations, right? It's not, launched and secured at a single moment in time. And so there's always a question of whether it will succeed. And I want to put, a fine point, I suppose, on a particular event recently, the January 6th siege of the Capitol building, because we so often say, this couldn't happen in America. Well, it did just happen in America. And it could happen in America. There's nothing, and I think the founding generation grasped this very well. There's nothing about America that makes it less susceptible to the authoritarian temptation than other countries if we're just not willing to do the hard work of democracy. So again, I want to turn to Madison in that sense. But so even while defending popular government and the Republican experiment, the Federalist, including Hamilton here, spoke powerfully to the vices of popular government, right? Deeply concerned again about the popular arts, where the people might be stimulated by some irregular passion, or where the people, again, might be misled by the artful misrepresentations of interested men. So let me start with Madison's thinking about popular government then. He made a crucial distinction between two species of popular government. He distinguished between a pure democracy, where the people meet and exercise the government in person, and a republic, where they assemble and administer it by their representatives and agents, right? So, and that's a distinction I want to come back to in a moment, because I think that's the distinction you hear floated. We don't live in a democracy, we live in a republic, and I have a little bit to say about that. So while Madison began from the premise that the will of the people ought to ultimately govern us, he insisted that political institutions and intermediary civic institutions were essential in cultivating the cool and deliberate sense of the community, in his words. This is the essence of Madison's republicanism, I think. By way of representation and other devices, Madison sought to put distance between the government and the people to better secure the public good. But just as surely, Madison ultimately wanted the government accountable to the people. So the fundamental question is how to strike this balance, how to create a popular government that would not succumb either to the irrationality of the people or to a tyrannical government, right? The seminal texts of Madison's constitutionalism are Federalist 10 and 51. They speak to this balance, even while they do not represent the whole of his thinking. And in fact, I hope in the question and answer period to actually turn to some of Madison's arguments from the 1790s, which are often overlooked. And I think it's kind of the first great instance of Madison taking his own advice. Madison starts a skeptic of what we would think of as political parties today, but then very quickly realizes that under our constitutional system, they're inevitable, and actually then tries to harness them and use them as a means to educate the public mind. And so I hope to talk more about the 1790s Madison, kind of the overlooked Madison in some sense. And I think consistent with the Madison I want to portray from Federalist 10 and 51, more in the question and answer period. But so if Madison starts with Federalist 10 and arguing for this large republic with a diversity of interest, and I'll have more to say about that in a moment, but then the separation of powers as articulated in Federalist 51, I think rests on this foundation. It reflects the diversity of interests in a large republic by way of political institutions, but it also structures institutions in a manner that attempts to contain overly ambitious government officials. So it's these two features of Madison's thinking that I want to focus on. And I just want to highlight something we tend to overlook. I mean, the first feature and the most important feature for Madison, that is that we're going to have a large republic of diverse interests, is largely one of civil society. Right? I mean, by creating a large republic, you are going to create a particular kind of civil society, and that civil society for Madison will do much of the work in attempting to secure the public good. It's then Madison's institutional separation of powers that rests atop of that large republic. But it's the large republic in Madison's thinking, kind of civil society, that comes first in a way, and then political institutions that follow. Now, Federalist 10 also has some institutional pieces to it, but I want to really highlight the civil society parts because I also think the civil society parts can be really key for thinking about how we can better secure popular government in our own age. So when you think about popular government, Madison argues that representation is key. Representation is what is going to make Republican government superior to democratic government. And Madison also then takes Republican government that we had inherited a history of in the Western tradition and flips that logic and knowledge and inheritance on its head, right? Republican government, much like democratic government, had by and large been conducted on a small scale. Madison insists that actually the solution to the problem of Republican government will be to turn that around and to create a large republic. But just to pause again, to think more carefully about this distinction between a democracy and a republic, because it's become so prevalent in public debate these days. When Madison pointed to the critical distinction between a republic and a democracy, he was largely speaking to what we would now call direct democracy. Occasionally, the Hamilton and Madison both refer to democracy as pretty close to synonymous with republicanism. And you start to see that emerge, but by and large, when they say democracy, they mean a pure democracy. Now, what a democracy and a republic have in common for the founding generation is that both are popular forms of government, where the people alone are the ultimate authority. The difference for Madison at the time of the founding was that a republic, again, you had representation, right? You had representation, and that put distance between the people and the government. And that for Madison was a virtue. Whereas in a direct democracy, the people represented themselves. And Madison has this famous line from the Federalist Papers referring to Athenian democracy that said, look, even if every citizen of Athens had been a Socrates, the assembly would have still been a mob, right? And that says something about the nature of direct democracy for Madison that we want to get to more fully as I go. But so when Madison insists on representation, his argument is that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves. So in dividing this, between a pure and a pure democracy and a representative republic, I want to say that the distinction you hear so often in public today is largely a specious distinction. When people say, we're not a democracy, we are a republic, I think they're being disingenuous, because when we say democracy today, almost nobody means, oh yeah, pure democracy like they had in Athens. What they mean is representative democracy with individual rights that protects minorities and limits government in some way. That's exactly how Madison used republic. So they're largely synonymous as we think of them today. They are both forms of representative government rooted in some understanding of popular sovereignty that also limits and cabins that popular sovereignty to protect individual rights and to prevent majorities from simply ruling outright in many instances. So I think that, turning to Madison kind of gives us a better understanding of how we think about both democratic and Republican government today. But so let me say why Madison preferred representation. Madison preferred representation in this large republic because he thought that representatives would be drawn from a more knowledgeable class of people, and they would be somewhat insulated from the people, right? Representatives were not simply to be the mouthpiece of the people, but to reflect on their own as they deliberate about public issues. Representation acts to refine and enlarge the public views by way of having them engaged by a representative body. So public ideas and issues for Madison were better engaged by this representative body precisely because they would have to pass through, as he called it, thinking of especially the Congress, a temperate and respectable body of citizens. So Madison argued that representatives themselves, selected by citizens to be sure, were more likely to be knowledgeable and informed. Their wisdom made them more likely to discern the true interests of the country and less likely to sacrifice it to temporary and partial considerations. Consider that Madison's great fear with popular government was that faction, that self-interested groups, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community, would more easily prevail in a pure democracy or a small republic. So when you think of the large republic, the great virtue for Madison is precisely that you have this diversity of interest. And he in fact wrote about this in the 1780s prior to the Constitutional Convention and the like in Virginia with regard to religious liberty. In the Memorial and Remonstrance, Madison first kind of sketches the argument he'll later make in Federalist 10 about a large republic with a diversity of interests where these kind of clashing interests will really hold one another at bay and create a space where you can then construct the public good. He thought the same thing about religious liberty and a diversity of religious sects with a C, to be clear on that. So when Madison was thinking about religion, he said, look, if you have one religion or two religions in a particular political community, you're likely to either get kind of dominance or perpetual fighting, depending on how big they are. But if you have a multitude of religions, you're far more likely to have no particular religion prevail, and then they all have an interest in something like religious liberty, because it's the way they can kind of accommodate one another and survive. And that same kind of insight was put forward by Madison in thinking about the large republic. And I'll say more about this in a second, because I want to turn to the political institutions that do this. But for Madison, and I think this is especially important for us to think about in our day and age, the public interest was something that was constructed. And it was constructed by and large by way of representative institutions. And so the public interest was not simply kind of adding up a bunch of individual interests and seeing which prevail, in a majority. And it was not something you could just, take from on high and say, well, this is clearly it. It was something that was actually constructed by way of politics, right? And so the key about the large republic and then the separation of powers is it's supposed to help nourish this idea of a public good that's constructed by way of our representatives and representative institutions. So let me say how I think political institutions do this. So in accord with the large republic, which again, Madison said is the primary way to create this equilibrium between the interests and the passions of society itself, American political institutions are crafted to be responsive to the people over time, but to put space between the people and their representatives in the short run. Right? As Madison puts it in Federalist 57, the aim of every political constitution is, or ought to be, first to obtain for rulers men who possess most wisdom to discern, and most virtue to pursue the common good of society. And in the next place, to take the most effectual precautions for keeping them virtuous whilst they continue to hold their public trust. So within the separation of powers, the various conflicted interests of a diverse and extended republic get voiced. So it's a dynamic.
Excuse me, do you have any of the cotton swabs that aren't plastic in the middle? Aisle 09?
Okay, go ahead. I muted Peyton. Okay.
All right. So that was an interesting diversion. I have no swabs. So this is a dynamic and contentious interaction between the branches of government, but it's designed to achieve the public good by channeling, shaping, and refining popular opinions. And I won't belabor it here, but in the Q&A, I'm happy to kind of go over how the institutions themselves actually represent different varieties of the people themselves. So they're kind of set up, voicing different segments of the population and their interests, and then forcing us to work those out in crafting public policy rooted in some notion of a common interest. And so while we associate Madison first and foremost with checks and balances and the idea that government itself must be limited and contained, I think even within the separation of powers, that separation of powers is designed to refine popular understandings, especially within the large republic. Indeed, Madison's most famous discussion of the separation of powers. The quote you've all probably heard from him in Federalist 51, where ambition must be made to counteract ambition, concludes with a discussion of the large republic, where Madison says, in the extended republic of the United States, and among the great variety of interests, parties, and sects which it embraces, a coalition of a majority of the whole society could seldom take place on any other principles than those of justice and the general good. So here, Federalist 51 really kind of echoes Federalist 10 and the logic of the extended republic. And what's crucial again here is the construction of the public good. And I'll quote Madison again in showing how he brings this out. The many parts, interests, and classes of citizens that come from civil society, right, come to a head within the separation of powers. And the separation of powers representing these different parts, interests, and citizens passes these views through a medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country. And so that last part, true interests of their country, is from Federalist 10. And the point again is that Madison's kind of repeating this argument that it's first representation, right? And a representative who's in part largely responsible for educating the public mind, engaging the public, speaking for their voices, but also, right, speaking for them in a way that seeks to temper and moderate the public mind. Indeed, Madison repeats this argument in his defense of the Senate. I suppose something we should think of in our contemporary context, where he says when it's clashing with the House, but he defends it as a temperate and respectful body of citizens that can correct the public mind. And I want to just dwell on that for a moment, right? Because this, I think this in some sense is, again, the essence of Madison's republicanism or democratic thinking, again, if we use them interchangeably. The job of representation is often to correct the public mind. Now, let's be clear, this is not because the people are necessarily stupid or ignorant. I want to put myself in the same position. I am a professor of government, and yet in the state of California, I am every election year routinely asked on referendum to deliberate about things that truthfully I'm not equipped to deliberate about, right? I mean, that these things would be better left to legislatures where the legislature could actually inform me as a citizen of the issues and then give me a choice about them. And it's that understanding, I think, that we are really at risk of losing as we treat the American public as if it has these sort of well-organized and well-thought-out political priorities that just need to be easily translated into public policy. And so it's really just the job of representatives to take that and put that into public policy. But that's really not, the empirical evidence suggests, what the public looks like, right? And so again, this is not because we should have contempt for the public in any way. And when I speak of the public in this manner, again, I'm including myself, a professor of government here. It's because we don't often know or understand the full complexity of the issues. And so it's the job of representation to work us through those. And it's the job of representatives to actually then engage in that process of constructing the public good. That's part of, as Madison said, and the Madison vision suggests, refining and enlarging the public mind. And as Madison put it, particularly in a large republic, the extended republic, it's often difficult to ascertain the real opinion of the public. Public opinion is not a simple given, nor is it necessarily reflective of the public good. So when Madison speaks of the permanent aggregate interests of the community or of the public good, he has something more in mind than, say, either kind of objective interest group bargaining or simply translating, what one portion of the population thinks into policy. The point, again, is to engage the multiplicity of interests that are out there, but also to kind of weigh and balance them, thinking what will secure the good for the future, right? And so it's not just the extended Republican representation that does this, but institutional design for Madison helps provide the kind of political leadership that the country, that a republic or a democracy as a representative form of government needs. And it's precisely because deliberation reflection, a clash of interests, some compromise and moderation are required to bring that about. That, Madison hopes to channel this by way of the separation of power. So the Madisonian vision sought to kind of force this recognition by building and requiring the building of complex political majorities that are a necessary feature of the large republic in a system of separated powers. Now, just thinking about our representatives as I begin to conclude, this required knowledge and deliberation. It requires taking into account different views and interests and builds from there. I want to suggest this is the hard labor of democracy. Yet when we think of our representatives today, too often Congress is engaged in a different sort of representation. They're engaged more in a kind of performative politics, where they're concerned much more with media tweeting and public appearances, media appearances and a tweeting, rather than engaging in the difficult task of legislating for the public good. And in fact, you may have heard the stories, but there are a few new members of Congress who have even acknowledged outright that in hiring their new staffs, they didn't hire anyone who actually had knowledge of particular issues or legislation or expertise. What they hired were communications experts, right? And so what they're really looking for is to engage in this more performative politics that's really all about media appearance and posturing and the like. And that's very far removed from the hard work of legislation and crafting the public good that Madison had in mind by way of not just our representative institutions, but especially Congress, right? And it's no coincidence when we think about the Constitution that Madison helps bring into being, that the first article, Article 1, speaks to Congress, right? I mean, the first branch of government. It's no coincidence that it's the first branch of government, because it's the branch of government where representation and deliberation occurs. Now, let me just quickly conclude in thinking about, in painting this broad picture of Madison, and really, I think, trying to use Madison as a foil to our more populist and folk understandings of democratic government today. So, at the time Madison made his argument, much of it about the large republic was largely speculative. And in truth, it's only partially been confirmed in the 200 plus years of representative democracy in America. And while he wrote eloquently about the passions of the public sitting in judgment rather than their reason, he also, and I want to be clear about this, insisted on popular government as superior to other forms of government. So even while he insisted that we want to resist the popular impulse, and not simply because men are not angels, which applies again to those in power just as readily as it does to citizens, but because he worried that in the ordinary course of things, the public might be misled or inflamed. And so while this, again, positions Madison as a critic of pure democracy, of populist forms of democracy, of kind of folk democracy, he's nevertheless a defender of popular government. And I want to think of Madison as attempting to design American political institutions to overcome the weaknesses of popular government, which required enlightening the public mind, even while being ultimately dependent upon the public. And let me conclude on this note. I think we've lost the part of representative democracy or Republican government in our Republican experiment that insists upon educating the public mind, of refining the public mind, of sometimes telling the public mind that it's wrong. And our challenge today strikes me as remarkably similar to Madison's challenge. It's right, how do you thread the needle of creating a government that is popular government, but avoids the temptation of an unenlightened and unreasonable kind of populist understanding of democracy that's very likely to succumb to some form of authoritarianism, or the alternative, which would be, to give up on democracy and engage in kind of rule by the knowledgeable and elites. And I didn't say as much about that, but I think that that's also a dangerous temptation. And so I think our challenge is the same really as Madison's challenge. And I think Madison is an able partner in thinking about the challenges we face in the early years of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, George. Matt, your turn, after which, as a reminder, we'll take question and answers, and George and Matt will have a chance to converse as well. Matt, thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Professor Kraitu, and to the Tocqueville workshop for inviting me here. And also thank you to Professor Thomas for your talk and sharing your chapter as well. I've appreciated both. So I think what I'd like to do is to very briefly summarize what I take to be the two main themes of your chapter. And then out of those, I have a series of a few questions drawing out of both of those. One, just kind of a narrow question, and then a few broader ones that I'll follow up on. So to begin, I think what I've taken to be the primary themes from your discussion is first, that's that creation of space, specifically where there needs to be separation out from the immediate energies of the public and their representatives. I often like to discuss this with my students in terms of the public's like gasoline, it's explosive. So you need an engine and a structure to convert that energy into productive forward movement, since left by itself, like humans are quarrelsome creatures. And going along with that space and the proper management of it, I take the second theme to be the usefulness of diversity, and specifically diversity leading to conflict that can be institutionalized. And through that institutionalization, it can be refined and again leveraged into proper productive forward movement through the right structures. So to begin with a quick and more narrow question, I wanted to pose an inquiry to you regarding your enrollment of Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance into your larger discussion. In particular, to preview my thinking here, I think the memorial hangs a little bit oddly along with the other things such as Federalist 10 and the broader conflict in the public through interest groups and, well, not interest groups, but factions. Specifically for the audience, I'll mention that the memorial and remonstrance was a response to a general assessment bill pushed in Virginia that would have laid a tax on the Virginian public in support of a religion, though that would have been set up, at least in the initial draft, as a system of pluralism where you choose your own denomination and that church would be benefited. And if you don't opt for anything, it just goes to the county school. So Madison pushed back against this, despite the fact that it, in the first instance, had some protections for pluralism, specifically, firstly, that what's pluralistic today can easily turn into a singular course of establishment tomorrow. I like a little bit, Madison argued that distance, as it may be in the present, informed from the Inquisition, it differs only in degree. If we give the church some degree of support, eventually the Episcopal Church will be the only church in Virginia. And further, Madison here was building off of John Locke's arguments, specifically saying that the internal domain of your soul is your own business. The state simply needs to stay out of it because it can't coerce specific belief internally. And I think it's on that point of separation and partition of religion out of politics that I think that there's a little bit of at least friction on my reading. And that in the other instances, when we're talking about party politics, factions, or the internal organs of the national government, they're all harnessing conflict and specifically building it into institutions so that way those conflicts play out against each other. Whereas in this instance, we have kind of more the politics of omission where conflict needs to be separated out. And we're going in a slightly different direction. So ultimately a small quibble, but I wanted to invite you on that point to help repair my understanding a little bit. So moving forward, I wanted to bring up, I guess, a few more general questions. And specifically, this touches on that sense of distance between the public and the direct administration of government and striking that right balance. I'd like to kind of unpack that notion of like the ways distance can be formed. And specifically, I'd like to suggest that there are at least 3 versions of distance that are coming through in your discussion of Madison. The first of which would be distance as distinction, or filtering for minific character of learning, a different social station, cultural authority to be able to speak in that public educational role, since they have that elevated position in society. They also have, you know, that expanded continental vision where they can see the common good. And also, I think importantly, they're also blind in the correct ways to the local, particular, and ephemeral concerns that don't properly aggregate up, as you mentioned, to the national level and the true common good. I'd suggest a second version of that distance is the distance in time that comes with the varying elongations of terms of service. And in particular here, I'm drawing a little bit of inspiration from Simon, another one of our graduate students here, is specifically thinking of that distance in time as a mechanism of structuring collective memory over time, by which way, again, ephemeral concerns are filtered out. So that way we elongate out collective memory. So that way we filter for the important signals through the noise. And a third species of difference, and this comes with extending the sphere and bringing in that diversity, is simply that spatial difference. And in connection with that, I'm specifically going to channel a little bit like the anti-federalist concerns here, is that spatial difference in some degree breaks up the possibility of politics as common sense and politics as that populism, in part because the like literal common sensorium of our ability to commonly see everything together that comes with local politics has been fragmented and dispersed because the polity is now operating on a much larger scale. So across those 3 dimensions of diversity, I'm hoping just to like solicit your thoughts about how that project that you mentioned of finding the right balance of the space between can be structured potentially along multiple dimensions. Perhaps they're complementary, perhaps some are more important than others, but I'd like to ask your thoughts on that. For a further item, I'd actually like to reverse direction, and this will be touching on your discussion of the role of public education and leadership by elected representatives. Specifically here, I have a small quotation from the National Gazette from Madison, where he mentions whatever facilitate that general intercourse and sentiments as good roads, domestic commerce, free press, and particular circulation of newspapers through the entire body of the people, representatives going from and returning to every part of them, is equivalent to the contraction of territorial limits and is favorable to liberty. So on this point, I would like to potentially frame your discussion against balancing and finding the correct mean between the extremes of that distance between the people and the representatives as being a 2-step process. One, in the previous instance of building out that separation between the minific character and the populists, but also in a second instance of creating these artificial supplements of public education, of contracting space in a new means that is qualitatively different from what it replaced originally, but is still functioning to collapse the polity back down after expansion. One final item that I'd like to offer that might hopefully tie both that and the past 2 items together is simply thinking about this and Madison's project potentially in terms of the construction of the collective political vision of a polity together. In particular, as I mentioned, for finding and filtering for minific character with proper vision, who like see what they need to for national interests and are also blind when they need to be. along also with the fracturing of the common sensorium of local politics and its reconstruction through public education, is that one way that we might think of Madison is in part, it's the politics of who sees what, when, and how, rather than who gets what, when, and how. So along those lines, again, thank you very much for your presentation. I've enjoyed this. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. And again, thank you to Aurelian and the Tocqueville Workshop as well for inviting me here today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Matt, for your excellent comments. George, I'd like to give you a chance to say a few things, and then I just to remind everyone, the chat room is open. You can raise your hand as well. We'll have two first questions coming from Jacob and Les, I'll take the other ones in the order that I received. George.
No, thank you so much, Matt, for those great comments. So let me I think I would accept you called it a quibble, but I think I'll accept your quibble with the memorial and remonstrance. I guess there are two parts to the memorial, and the one that you focused on, I think, is right, that it's really worried about establishment. And so there's this question when you think of religious liberty, does it kind of channel in the same way? What I guess I'd say is accepting all of what you said about really being kind of preoccupied by an establishment. And no, it's an interesting argument. I don't want to get too off because some critics of Madison say this seems a little overwrought. This looks like it's a kind of neutral law where the government would fund all religions, and so this actually embraces the kind of pluralism you're actually arguing for. So why are you so distraught about this? And Madison was insistent, right, that no, this is actually the first step toward a kind of establishment. And so I think that part of your argument's right. Even so, right, within defending it, Madison, repeatedly insists, and this is the first time he starts to make an argument about how a diversity of something, religious, religion in this case, can act, and by extending the sphere, even he says in the memorial, can actually be beneficial. And so I agree that they don't map all together, but when you actually look back to Federalist 10, there are, when he's referring to opinions, passions, and interests, I mean, certainly religious opinions are one of the things that he could seemingly have in mind there. And that's the kind of argument I think he makes in the memorial and remonstrance. And it's important, right, that one of the really crucial parts of Madison's memorial is precisely that religion actually, be treated in essence as an opinion that someone's embracing, right? I mean, it's an obligation to God, but how you view that obligation is a matter of personal choice, right? And so once you make that step, he says, right, and then you can widen the sphere and allow for the proliferation of religious sects, again, especially by way of Zoom, with a C in that case, right? So I do think that kind of clash, and he even has an argument toward the end of the memorial where he says, look, when we've widened, in the American arena, where we've widened the sphere, we've been able to breathe more easily because of it. And there's this, there becomes also this kind of self-interest in the clash. And he doesn't actually think, oh, people will all now act on good faith. Madison, has these worries that people won't, and takes that as the beginning point, much like he does in Federalist 10, but precisely because there will be, so many different interests, or in this case, so many different religious opinions, it will be much more difficult for any one to dominate. I think that's the part that actually has really interesting parallels with Federalist 10. But again, I think that Matt is right about the differences. I actually think then, to move on to your second point, I think that that's the most important point you make. And I think it's a really excellent point to say that there really are different forms of placing space or distance between representatives and the people. And I especially want to just note your first one, because I think that's a great place to not only point to it in Madison, but to really kind of raise some questions about how we think of that space today, because as you noted, I think rightly, you pointed to the fact that in some ways, Madison was depending potentially on a kind of social standing of some of the representatives, right? A social standing that we are maybe more skeptical of today, of one's place in society that was not nearly, say, small d democratic as American society would ultimately become. And so does that kind of distance actually work anymore? I think it is a fair question. And I think there's and I think this is, an area where Madison's own thinking probably evolves over time. And I think that there's an argument to be made that Madison had that vision of separation, kind of your first vision of space, in the Federalist Papers and during the Constitutional Convention. And it almost, invited a sort of indifference from public leaders, indifferent being that they weren't captured by particular interests and sort of were above the political fray. And that's a version of representation that I think you get in Madison a lot. Whereas by the 1790s, I think he's already thinking that version doesn't work as well, right? That in fact, you kind of need to be potentially in the political fray, but being in the political fray by way of political parties, newspapers, and all of those things you point to, that doesn't mean that you still are simply going with the whatever the immediate desires of your constituents are. I mean, so it's a different kind of representation. And I think it's the 1790s version that's probably much more in tune with how we think of things than the potential differences from the 1780s. And let me just, I don't want to be too long on these, but let me say, I think that the time is a really great point, that's different from space. And let me say just quickly, kind of the separation of powers here. And it matters for Madison, right? Because when you think of the different versions of the people, in some sense, right, time is one of the things that helps put distance between representatives and the immediate wants of the people. And right, so it's not weird that the House of Representatives meets every 2 years. And so the distance you get between having to stand for re-election, having to put yourself before the people is much, much closer than the time a senator gets. It's 6 years. And that's part of the reflection of both being responsive to the people, but also trying to create this space with the people. And so I think, that time is a really good point to think about. I'll try to be really quick on the spatial to leave it for, further discussion. I think this is an excellent point. And I think it's a point that might say, to the degree that all our politics over the last decade or so seems to have become national, does this work anymore? Right? I mean, have we kind of collapsed interesting space and difference? And so people, that were, once had, various forms of insulation because they were really serving their constituents in a more local way. Now they're really kind of judged in national terms. Does that kind of spatial difference create a politics that's just very different from the world that Madison inhabited? And I think that's a great question, and I'll have to think more about that. Let me just, the collective vision I'll leave because I don't want to go too long, and I think that'll probably come out anyway. You cut out on the public education question. And so I can't do your question justice because I think at its most important moment, on my end at least, it kind of got filtered out. But I'll say the quick word there is, Madison very much also came to think of public education as a way to create, first and foremost, actually, leaders, as we would now call them, or representatives, political officers that would be knowledgeable, but also really kind of equipped to think about the public interest, right? And that could also be engaged in part of that education. And Madison not only was supportive of schools in Virginia, but he, of course, was You know, one of the kind of forgotten founders of the University of Virginia, we put Jefferson there. Madison was actually kind of more important, not more important, but just as important in creating the University of Virginia, and more important actually in designing its early curricula. And as you know, so often Madison was more sober and more moderate than Jefferson, and actually created a curriculum that would, you know, transcend sort of anti-federalist, federalist, or Jeffersonian understanding, saying, look, they've all got to be part of this project. And I'll plug my earlier work here. Madison was a longstanding advocate of a national university. And I actually think his advocacy of a national university kind of harkens back to Matt's first point about space and representation, in that you'd actually be cultivating, you know, almost the equivalent of a leadership class. I think it could be, you know, deeply small d democratic and that open to all, but also no question, you know, that you know, the people who would be educated there would have a different position, station, as it were, in society. And there's some things about the national university vision of a Madison that really go with an earlier version of representation, I think, which is kind of above the political fray. And I think that, you know, there's a tension in Madison's thinking all along between those different pieces. I have to confess, your collective vision question was a great one, but I've forgotten the thread of it. So I'll leave that for the Q&A.
Okay, good. Thank you, George. Have your pen ready, because what we're going to do, in the interest of making this is a conversation, I'm going to invite 3 people to make comments, questions, and then you can wrap up your comments around those 3. So on the list, I have a student, Peyton, and then Jacob and Les first. And then I have on the list Bill, Mark, and Michael. So let's start with Peyton, Jacob, and Les has the question in the chat. Peyton.
Okay, my question is for Matt here, and I was really interested in your talk about how there needs to be separation from the political atmosphere and the people, and I was just curious on how much separation there needs to be before we start to democratic, you know, point of view, and before the people start to kind of left out of choose be, you know, a big influence of still what is going on.
Okay, I'm not sure the question came through because of the bandwidth being low, but Matt, you got I hope the gist of it. Jacob, thank you.
Sure, thank you, Aurelian. George, so I'm a bit curious about. I've always sensed the tension with Madison. I heard again in your paper about the role of representation itself and who's representing. And so there's this issue of, you know, that we might be selecting more sober, cooler tempered people to be representing us, but then the actual act of representing, the responsibility of representing, and then the deliberative institutions that they legislate in, that all those things also actually kind of change the course of debate, which in some ways kind of may suggest that who's doing the representing isn't so much important as that they're in this institutional setting, and which then opens the door to some things like sortition democracies or representation by lottery. And I guess I'll even connect that with your comments about the education system, or I hope you will, because I understand that Madison had a longstanding debate with Jefferson about the role of the natural aristocracy, and he was very skeptical of them, whereas Jefferson saw them as like a great boon to a society. Madison saw them as a potential danger, and that whereas Jefferson saw the education system as a way to sort and select the best, maybe Madison thought some education might actually happen, and it's not just to pull out leaders, but to teach. So, okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. Les, would you like to read your question, or would you like me to read it?
No, I'll just ask it. I thank you, Aurelian. George, you started out by talking about the musical Hamilton. And so this seems like a trivial question, but it has a serious point. Could you envision there ever being a popular musical called Madison with an exclamation mark? And if not, is that because the Madisonian approach to democracy is more complicated and demanding, and as a result is less likely to capture the popular imagination? If so, what does that say about the need for popular education that Madison was so interested in?
Okay, thank you. I think we have a wonderful set of questions here. George and Matt, you can take it from here, and then we'll move on to the second round.
I'll take the Hamilton question. Is a great question, actually. That Hamilton musical question's a great question. I think you're right. It's hard to envision a musical about Madison. And in fact, my only complaint about Hamilton, I think it's absolutely brilliant in all ways, is it's just Hamilton is just wrong there. I mean, Madison is wrong. That's not Madison. Madison actually is sober and the like, but he has a completely wicked sense of humor. And he kind of comes through as this kind of dull, plodding guy, methodical, thoughtful, and designing, but he doesn't come through enough. But you're right, there couldn't be a musical about him. And so does that say something about his capturing the notion of, the kind of the popular imagination that's maybe necessary for how we think about democracy? And so, I guess I'd even push your question in a way, if I could, and maybe this is the spirit of it. Is there something does Madisonian constitutionalism, Madisonian republicanism, Madisonian democracy kind of inescapably tend in these other directions? Because, even if it's actually designed to go with self-interest in taking human beings as they are, does it in some sense not speak to what really animates ordinary citizens? And so therefore, because it requires even then too much of us in some sense, that it's going to go the other way. And I think that there's something to that, right? It's not weird that all the tributes to Madison, the very bookish James Madison, are largely books. And there's a kind of proliferation of books on him. And he's actually gotten, I think, his credit these days, in that he used to be kind of, second fiddle to Jefferson and Hamilton. And that's where Hamilton, brilliant as it is, goes wrong. And, almost no scholar treats him that way today. But that's an excellent point about his vision of democratic government. Even if it doesn't really rely on public virtue, I think it does actually demand more of us. And so let me connect that answer, I think, to the great question about representation. And I think to take kind of the first part of it and thinking about Madisonian democracy, I think that, this was Jacob's question, right? The representation is kind of a twofold thing for Madison, or let's say even at least twofold. And you're right that the first part probably often depends upon kind of who you are and the station in life, and that there's a kind of person, right? Your outstanding characters, right? This is and when we think of the early electoral college, that how it was going to work in some sense, right? You'd have you knew it was a Washington, and so you'd be voting for those kinds of characters. And I think that there's no question there's something about that with Madison's understanding of representation, and I think he certainly thinks that that those sorts of people will, and especially in an extended republic, filter to the top, and there'll be more of them. But I also think, and I think the second part of your question is really right on, and I also think it probably captures how we think of things more, and I think even how probably Madison started to think of things much more in the 1790s, and that's that. Yes, you want those types to come out, but that won't necessarily be because of things like social standing. Certainly, the first generation of founding leaders had that. But most, not Hamilton, but most others were born to privilege in some way, right? And so I think then Madison's understanding is, as you put it, that it's you're by way of kind of institutional design and civil society being the extended republic, where you have a large number of people to draw on within this force, but also then, you know, kind of pushing them through these different institutions will more likely lead to the kind of representation he wanted that's quite different from, say, social standing. The one catch there, I think, and I think this is where, you know, if this is a workshop in American ideas, as we can't underplay the degree to which kind of ideas about representation also were then deeply important to Madison. And I think it's the, you know, the idea of representation was not that you were just a mouthpiece of the public. And I think that is where education fits in part for Madison. And I actually take, again, Jacob's point. I would agree with Jacob's point about Madison being, in this sense, much more kind of small d democratic than Jefferson, thinking that it was the educational institutions themselves. It's not like they would just pluck out genius and that's what we needed. It was the institutions themselves would actually be the ones engaged in kind of cultivating the individual and reflecting. And that's why the curriculum was so important to Madison. And I think that's also, and that kind of mirrors his argument about the separation of powers as well, because the separation of powers is meant to kind of force that kind of both deliberation and reflection and compromise, and I'll even throw in moderation for Aurelian on that score. But I mean, you're right, the institutions are designed to kind of push that, but you also have to have the idea that a representative is capable of kind of really reflecting about the public good, independent of simply what people are demanding. But then, and this goes back, I think, to Matt's point, and that's that when you think about the different kinds of space, that's also meant to foster that, right? I mean, so the idea is senators should actually be, even in self-interested terms, more able to be more reflective and long-sighted, you know, far-sighted than members of the House. And again, that's kind of institutions cultivating a particular kind of representation, but it still depends upon, I think, people having certain ideas about representation. And then I'm sorry to say this, Aurelian, but the first question didn't come through at all for me, except for the fact that, and I don't have a lot to say different than what I just said, except for I took it to be, you know, there is this kind of precarious balance about you want to create space between the people to engage in, you know, partly these educative functions, but also just in, you know, terms of actually trying to reflect, you know, good representation and construction of the public good. But there's a deep worry, I took it underlying that question, of too much space can actually alienate the people. And you could see why they could kind of get turned off by representative politics. At least I thought that was maybe part of the question. It was really choppy in coming through Zoom.
Let's see, Matt. Yeah, Matt, would you like to add something to Peyton's question?
I have to confess, I also, like the internet,
Matt?
just kind of consumed that. So can you all hear me? Okay, yeah, I got a sense that there's something about the striking the correct balance between like the popular inputs and elites at a higher level. But beyond that, I didn't really pick up what the question was getting at. Say it's like honestly just a very tricky question and one that like just has the world.
Yeah, thanks. We will we will have a chance to maybe come back to it, but I'd like to thank for the patience. We'll go second round. Bill Sherman, Mark Yellin, and Michael Weinman. Bill, thanks for waiting.
Yeah, no problem. Hey, George, thanks for a great talk. I very much enjoyed the papers. So I guess as a big question, I may not get to it right away, so I'll start with a smaller one. You know, you began by saying we don't want to engage in founder worship, right? And we agree about that. Nonetheless, the basic framework of your paper, of course, is Madisonian, you know, and I'm just trying to figure out how much of Madison we want to hold on to, right? So, you know, even if we accept this old-fashioned notion, which you get in Madison, which is very controversial for contemporary democratic theory, right, about the representative as a kind of filter, I'm having a hard time seeing how Madison can help us understand why that's not working today, all right? So, you know, I'll just throw this out as a political scientist. You know, why are our representatives actually not just not the best people, but among the worst people, arguably? Let's be honest, we have some truly atrocious people running the country. I mean, yesterday during the impeachment hearings, 15 Republican senators walked out because they were bored, apparently. This is just shocking to me, you know? I would take anyone from my undergraduate democratic theory class at this point and stick them in the Senate, but that's a different issue. I think they're better informed. You know, so there's a problem here. But the problem is not, I mean, it's distance, but there is distance, right? So, but here's the distance. It's campaign finance. You know, they spend all of their time raising money. That's how you get to be a politician, if you talk to these people, right? So that's the kind of person who's going to go into politics. You know, there's gerrymandering. So we're getting the most extreme people in the parties oftentimes, right? I mean, so there are a whole bunch of things we could talk about. I just don't see how Madison, number one, he doesn't speak to those things. And number two, they do seem to be related somehow to this more or less Madisonian republic of ours. So I mean, I'm just not sure how far we're going to get with Madison, right? And I guess just very quickly, I mean, I loved your Atlantic piece. I think that's right on the mark about minority rule, except it seemed to me what was missing was a suggestion that there's maybe I missed this in the piece, but a possibility that this tendency towards minority rule in our system is part of this Madisonian legacy. You know, I don't want to blame him for all of the problems with the US constitutional order. Obviously the world's complicated, but you know, he played a role in this system we have. We could talk about, you know, whatever, the Senate, all kinds of things, the Electoral College and so on. So, you know, how much of Madison, you said we don't want to blindly follow specific arguments, but nonetheless, I worry you're still following a few too many of his specific arguments. Sorry, I always feel like I'm just shouting at a computer screen with these things. I wish we could sit down.
Thanks. Thanks, Bill. Mark.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great talk, George. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, you're very good at what you do. A lot of things I want to respond to, but let me try and limit myself. I have not read your Atlantic article, and it seems from my next question, it seems like it'd be very relevant to the question, but I'll raise it anyways. Which has to do, first of all, I appreciated your distinction between actually the lack of distinction between republicanism and democracy in Madison, that they're both just republicanism is just democracy with representation. I think they both share the notion of majority rule. But I guess going to this question of minority rule is you know, in Federalist 10, Madison is very concerned about the tyranny of majority faction and you know, and setting up things, and it's also reflected in Federalist 51, and that this. Frequently, when people make the distinction between republicanism and republic, not a democracy, they're saying, well, it's not just pure majority rule. That's the argument they're making. And I sort of suspect that Bill Schwerman is onto something, that there is a Madisonian legacy there somewhere. But I guess so. So then the question there is, what is Madison's take on the tyranny of majority versus, you know, Tocqueville's? Maybe that's too broad a question, but something along those lines. So then I want to connect this up to our present moment, and I'm sort of a fan of the Jonathan Rock book, Demosclerosis, which then became retitled The End of Government. And his thesis is that the Madisonian system has worked in terms of the multiplicity of interests, checking each other, so we don't have a tyranny of the majority, but it also means government doesn't work. And that this government not working as well has created a kind of tension that maybe we see these kind of populist outbursts, that people get frustrated that government isn't doing my bidding. Those people aren't listening to me. And of course, you know, the argument of interest group liberalism, you have all these groups that have developed over time. They know exactly what their interests are. They know how to pursue them. And if you're not part of that game, you're kind of blocked out. And I'll stop with that.
Okay, thanks, Mark. In the same vein, I think Michael Weinman has some comments and a quick question. Michael, would you like to ask your question?
I'll be super brief, right? Aurelian sort of knows. So basically my question is half of a quarter of Bill's question and a third of Mark's question. So I would just reserve my time just to ask you to say, like, basically one thing it seemed to me with the Republic versus democracy discourse, which you wanted to push back against, one way to push back against that would be to say that Madison is clearly a Democrat in our sense. Like, he hated if Madison were around, he would have hated Mike Lee's October 2020 tweet. So I wanted to ask, like, A, do you agree that he would have hated that tweet? And B, if so, is that a kind of answer to Bill's question regarding the Atlantic piece, that element of it, where the Madison really matters here, not because of founder worship, but because he has something that's actually really relevant for the 21st century, which is right, precisely because he was involved in all those compromises at the Constitutional Convention that led to minority rule. It's something like Madison's role in creating a constitution that he would have wanted to write that we need to do now. That's maybe impossible, but, you know, all these problems that we have with the overrepresentation of rocks in Montana and the Senate that are a legacy of slavery and so on and so forth, these are problems with Madisonian answers, not in the Constitution as written, because he had to compromise too much. And so I'm putting a lot of words in your mouth, but is something like that what you're aiming for?
Okay, George, you have plenty on your plate. Thank you.
Well, actually, I'm just going to say that, yeah, I think Michael answered my question for me. So that I'll take that as the answer to Bill and Mark. Actually, it's great to see you, Bill and Mark. Thanks for coming. But no, I think that I do agree with what Michael just said. I think most of it, at least. But let me start with Bill's, push. And I think it's a really good question. So, why? Who cares about Madison in this day and age, right? Is he responsible for part of this? And as much as thinking about him, how does he help us solve our problems? And I guess in a lot of ways, I think you're kind of right, Bill, that he doesn't in lots of ways. His problems aren't necessarily our problems in some sense. Certainly when you think about campaign finance, for instance, and redistricting, those, actually the redistricting, that's not right. Because when we think of redistricting and how we have representation, we kind of think our representative system works like it has forever. It didn't. Actually, even the Electoral College didn't initially work as it now does. It was actually when Virginia made the move to like all or nothing, and I think it was in just after the turn of the century, so in 18 something, that was a big deal. And that was unusual. So I think that's an instance of actually they did think about some of these things and thought it was problematic. Where I think Madison is helpful, right, is in thinking and limited, right, but helpful is in thinking about when we think about popular government and we think about democratic government, right, what do we mean by it, right? What do we think we want out of it? Why, not just why is it justified? And where I think Madison is particularly helpful is in actually taking democratic, Republican, popular democratic government seriously. And I would say, yeah, the answer to Mike Lee is, I actually start the Atlantic piece with it. I think it's really simple. It's like, as you're using those terms, you're simply wrong. You're trying to empower minority rule. Madison thought that was abhorrent. And I think that actually speaks to the tyranny. He was deeply worried about the tyranny of the majority, but his solution was not to say, okay, so let's empower minorities to actually rule. Let's protect minorities so they're not simply, especially when it comes to their rights. And so some things are off limits, right? And that's done by way of limiting democratic choice in lots of ways, protecting rights, designing institutions in particular ways, but it's not to empower minorities. But I think what's important about Madison there is that, so when you think about popular government and why it's good, but what are its problems? To me, some of the problems that you're speaking to, Bill, come from actually, we actually kind of have gone too small d democratic. When you look at the problem of parties, in ways, most political scientists agree what's really happened with parties, that both the extreme nature of candidates and actually the quality of candidates has occurred the more we've just empowered the people to choose by way of primaries, right? Because then it just becomes these kind of straight up votes by way of primaries, and the candidates we used to get based upon deliberation of the parties themselves. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene never gets to run for office in the old system. No way. She is simply taken out as crazy and unacceptable. There's just no way we will put her forward because the people running are like, look, it doesn't matter if she's going to garner more popular votes. The quality also matters. And so I think there's a deeply interesting tension there between trying to actually be sort of generally responsive to the populace in a democratic manner, and also, actually really recognizing small d democratic rights. But when you just kind of unleash popular understandings and allow for things like simple votes by the parties and by rank and file party members especially, it's not clear that that actually leads to good results, right? I mean, so then that is the question of how do you then come up with ways to kind of filter those understandings? The parties used to play that role. I mean, the parties, and Madison actually started thinking about this in the 1790s, right? When it was like, look, the idea of representation as this kind of elite, indifferent and removed person that's going to, articulate a public good vision, and the people will kind of, think about that and go along, that collapses really fast. And, Madison gets that. But then, so given that collapses, how do you also actually enlist the parties and newspapers and educational institutions to engage the public, but also then to actually not just, to both educate it and push back against it. And I think Madison is helpful in thinking about how we might think of parties in this regard, right? I mean, because I think party reform, if we're going to save American democracy for the 21st century, I think party reform is one of the things that really needs to happen. And you think of that, it's that kind of, as Bill said, that, those kinds of people in Congress. I mean, when you look, this is a little bit, too snide or condescending, but when you look at, members of Congress in the 20th century against members of the Congress in the 19th century, it's sometimes looking at the difference between incredibly smart people debating, things in an incredibly serious way, and kind of stupid people debating things that they really just don't even seem to get. Again, I think that's actually too extreme. There are, members of Congress well into the late years of the 20th century who are incredibly impressive. But so how do you do that? But you're right about lots of other issues. I don't know that he's always that very helpful, so I think that we have to think of those things on our own, right? And then we're looking at different thinkers who, may or may not be helpful. An area where Madison actually this is totally understudied in him. One of the areas he's interested when you talked about money in politics is his detached memoranda, which is usually read, it's written right at the end of his life, and it's usually read with regard to religious freedom, where he's really worried about establishment again, and is really worried about the government being hijacked by religion. But the other thing he's worried about there is moneyed interests hijacking the government as well. So that's, that kind of concern is there. Whether, that helps us think about it, how we do it today. I think for, the founding generation, campaign finance is just like, what? They don't have, so yeah, we have to think through those things on our own. The next piece actually I'm working on with my editor at The Atlantic on is against constitutional idolatry. So I think in that spirit, saying like, look, yeah, a lot of these things we're on our own about, and you're right. And there's a limited degree to which, earlier thinkers can help us work through. Some things I think they can, others I think you're right. There some pieces of them are useful, others aren't. And I hope that in thinking of the tyranny of the majority and minority spoke to Mark's question as well.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Mark. There are two short questions that will conclude our conversation. I want to read one quick comment by Kwang Yu, just for the sake of experience. Madison was among those who first advocated and experienced with modern popular government. He did not use the Rousseauian idea of popular sovereignty, and I think there was a reason for that, according to you, and if you want to comment on this. And then Noah Eberschmidt has a final question here. Quickly, Noah.
Hi, yeah, I just have a quick question, kind of a historical question here. So I see from teasing out from what you've said, and I really enjoyed the talk, really enjoyed the paper and the article, this kind of evolving vision that Madison has of the nature of public opinion, deliberation, representation, and ultimately just the interaction with the people that happens in the 1790s. I'm wondering if you had to sort of put your finger on what's the main impulse there, what is it? And I'm thinking particularly in regards to something like the mass amount of Federalist discourse in newspapers that's arguing the complete opposite, right? They're buckling down on don't talk to the people at all. They shouldn't even have political societies. And so I'm wondering just what you see as like the spur to the change in this thought. Okay, George, you have your last answer here.
That's a great question. I don't want to dismiss the popular sovereignty question at all. It's a little bit like, I mean, Madison rarely uses the term liberal. He's a liberal. He's a liberal Democrat, liberal constitutionalist. I don't want to, popular sovereignty is not something, I'm not sure he never invokes it. I'd actually have to go back and look. But it's right that it doesn't feature often. But he certainly had in mind in the end that repeatedly he says that power flows ultimately from the people. And that's absolutely clear in Federalist 40, where he says, look, the Constitution itself is nothing until the people ratify it, right? Is only legitimate once it's been given popular approval. And so, I mean, I think he has a profoundly different understanding of what popular sovereignty should look like than Rousseau. And so I guess that part of it's very different because Rousseau has that great line about how criticizing separation of powers and the like, where, you creating this artificial being and, that's detrimental to popular sovereignty. And I think Madison actually wants to, use that to like channel and harness some version of popular sovereignty. But on Noah's question, it's a great question. And actually, I think this maybe speaks to Bill's thinking as well, in a way. I think a couple of things push Madison, but I want to highlight one, and I talk about this in the paper, and that's the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. And I think why I think it speaks to Bill's question in part is, some of these ideas are sort of set in motion, but they're not fully worked out in any way. And why I find Madison actually particularly interesting is precisely that he's a thinker and kind of an actor. And so a lot of times his thinking is developing based upon, historical developments or political developments in his day, which he simply did not think about, right? And so those kinds of developments, something like, campaign finance today, simply pushes us to think, okay, how do we now address this question, given, say, our commitments? And maybe our commitments aren't Madison. Some of them certainly aren't and shouldn't be. I think some of them, at least, for me, are. But then that pushes us to think, so how do we then wrestle with that? And that's where, their thinking is, I think, useful. But it's what it's most useful in is helping us think about how to address issues, not solving them for us. But I think that in the 1790s, and this is especially true with regard to the Sedition Act, we simply really had not thought much about something like freedom of speech. And then how do you think about organized political parties that are engaged with one another, and you've got something like a loyal opposition that's committed to the constitutional scheme, broadly speaking, but disagrees profoundly about how you understand that, right? And there's kind of vague sense of some of this early on. And there were, reasonably robust understandings of freedom of speech throughout the late 18th century, even in England. It wasn't just this idea of no prior restraint, but the truth is, even when you're ratifying something like the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment, we don't really actually think very carefully about what these things mean, what it entails. We can kind of agree on free speech generally, but there's not like this fully worked out sense of, okay, and here's what it looks like. And what happens, I think, as John Adams, right, who gets portrayed sort of perfectly in Hamilton the musical. I think we put him on this pedestal. He's the only president I could imagine actually like tweeting in the same way that Trump does all of the time, or did, and they are engaged in silencing the opposition, and they're engaged not just in silencing the opposition, but essentially putting forward this vision of Republican government that it would be chilling to us because, and you get this from some of the judges, especially Samuel Chase, and that's that, like, look, your duty, once you've put somebody in office, your duty is acquiescence, right? Your duty is not actually to criticize the government. You be quiet. And they even lecture one of the critics of Adams, a newspaper writer journalist and friend of Madison's from Princeton. They're like, it is not your place to criticize John Adams. He's the president of the United States, right? He's been elected. You have not. We had the election. It's your duty essentially to now acquiesce. So shut your mouth. Equivalent. And Madison so is confronted really with, so wait, is this acceptable, right? How does this work with any notion of popular government? So I think that's a case where we're really working through what is the meaning of freedom of speech. How do political parties fit into this? How do you craft, an opposition that is like against the government in power, but against them because they think they're actually undermining the constitutional scheme and Republican government and popular government generally. And so I think that's kind of the impetus for it. And I think that happens a lot within American political thought and American constitutional development. There's just lots of questions that we don't really work out fully, and events kind of force us to. And I think both free speech and the idea of a loyal opposition and peaceful transfer of power, right, which we should really be thinking about right now, really all came out of the late 1790s in that regard.
A fitting end to an excellent talk. The testimony is there. You got excellent questions. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to Matt, and of course, a round of applause for George and Matt. Thank you. And just a reminder that we'll have another talk a week from today. If you want to stay a little bit or longer to ask any questions of George, a few more minutes, we'll keep this open. Otherwise, thanks to all. Stay safe and see you next week if you can join us. And I'm going to close the recording.